All right, today, as we continue exploring the big book chapter by chapter, this one will be Big Book History number 2. We're going to talk about the doctor's opinion. Now, to fully appreciate the writing of the doctor's opinion, we need to first cover a bit of the backstory. And let's start with a few basic facts about the man who offered his professional opinion on the alcoholics in that particular chapter. So here's our hero, Dr. William D Silkworth. He was born in 1873 and he died in 1951. He graduates from Princeton University in 1896. 3 years later, he graduates from Bellevue Medical School, and there he specialized in neurology, and he interned in the inebriate clinic. The inebriate clinic is a nice way of saying the drunk clinic. During the First World War, 1917 and 1918, he was in the U.S. Army Hospital at Plattsburgh, New York, and he was a member of the psychiatric staff there. From 1919, after the war ended, up to 1929, he was at Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, where he was an associate physician at the Neurological Institute. 1929 was the famous stock market crash. It wiped out a lot of people, including Dr. Silkworth. And he was let go by Presbyterian Hospital as an economy measure. Everybody was going into the unemployment line. That's why Dr. Silkworth ended up being the director of Towns Hospital in New York City. We don't know exactly when that happened, but certainly in sometime in 1930, I believe, he became the director of Towns Hospital in New York City. And then, interesting to me, in 1945, Knickerbocker Hospital in New York City. Now, this was a New York hospital that had an entire floor devoted to the reclamation of alcoholics. And that floor was staffed by not only medical workers, but also volunteer AA members were there. It was an Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill had talked about having a string of hospitals all across the country, and he always said we gave that idea up pretty quickly, but they didn't give it up pretty quickly. 1945, they had their own hospital in New York City, or at least a floor of their own hospital. So if you would like to know more details about Dr. Silkworth's life, there's this excellent book written by Dale Mitchell, published by Hazelton in 2002. Unfortunately, this book is currently out of print, and the ones online are really expensive, the used copies. But one of the things, if you don't know, you can do this. If your public library doesn't have a copy of this book, you can request an interlibrary loan, and your librarian will be able to get you a copy of that book. I've done that a number of times with a number of hard-to-find items. Silkworth officially enters the AA story when Bill Wilson makes his first trip to Towns Hospital in the fall of 1933. Now, Wilson drank again, and 9 months later, he's back there for his second visit, and he's drying out for the second time in Towns Hospital. And then he drinks again, and he's hospitalized for the third and final time in December of 1934. And Bill did not drink again past that point. And it's during the second visit, that Bill heard Dr. Silkworth explain to Lois how desperate his situation was. This, according to Wilson, in something he wrote in a very early version of his story, Bill's story. He hears Dr. Silkworth say to Lois, "The biggest fact about alcoholism is its obsessional nature. It's one of the most subtle yet most powerful compulsions known. Once its grip is firm, the chance for recovery is diminished. How to help the alcoholic to expel his obsession is the problem. But we doctors have had little success. It's seldom helped even, I've seldom helped even one in a case in 100. 1% success rate, not very good. More important, when Bill came back for his third visit to Towns Hospital and had his white light experience there, he was really, really worried that maybe he was losing his mind. And it was Dr. Silkworth who counseled him by saying, "Bill, listen, something has happened to you that I don't understand, but you had better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were." So he validated Wilson's spiritual experience. And that was tremendously important to Bill Wilson and tremendously important to the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson spends the next 5 months after he finally gets out of this third visit to Towns trying to help other alcoholics get sober. And Silkworth may have not have been too sure about what it was that Bill Wilson had, but he did believe that it might be helpful to at least some of his patients. So he allowed Bill free access to the hospital and to his patients. So Bill Wilson was on a mission here to get other people sober right from Jump Street. And he was doing most of his work at Towns Hospital. However, Bill had no success during those 5 months, and but after at the end of those 5 months, just before he goes to Ohio, he's going out there on a business venture, and it's going to be on that trip that he's going to meet up with Dr. Bob Smith. Wilson complained bitterly to Dr. Silkworth that he just hadn't been able to get anyone sober. He'd been doing all this hard work and nothing was happening. He had no success whatsoever. What's his problem? And the doctor advised him, Bill, you got to stop preaching at them and you got to give them the hard medical facts. Hopefully this will soften them up at death so that they'll be willing to do anything to get well. Then they may accept those spiritual ideas of and even your faith in God. And then in June of 1935, Bill Wilson goes out to Akron, Ohio, runs into Dr. Bob, and that new approach, which he tried on Dr. Bob Smith, worked perfectly. Thank you, Dr. Silkworth. Bill stayed in Akron for 3 months, returning to New York in August of 1935, leaving Dr. Bob and 2 other men sober in Ohio. And then he tried this new approach on patients in Towns Hospital. And in September, the very reluctant and agnostic Hank Parkhurst got sober. Bill's first success in New York City. Now, Hank's story, The Unbeliever, which appears in all first printings, 16 printings of the first edition, explicitly shows the freedom that Bill had in visiting Dr. Silkworth's patients in Towns Hospital. Hank talks about Bill showing up and talking to him, and Bill showing up and talking to him, Bill showing up and talking to him. So I think it's really, really an interesting snapshot of just how much freedom Bill Wilson had, according to the permissions given to him by Dr. Silkworth to talk to people in Towns Hospital. And then a month later, after he gets Hank sober, Fitz Mayo gets sober. And Fitz's story, Our Southern Friend, is one of only 3 stories to appear in all 4 editions of the book. Now, there were some significant changes to Fitz's story going along, but Fitz is a really central character. And along with Hank, these guys would be major players and influences in Alcoholics Anonymous during its earliest years. Besides being the doctor in charge of alcoholic patients at Towns Hospital and being extremely accommodating and letting members of the early fellowship try to sell their particular brand of sobriety to patients, Dr. Silkworth also made several other contributions to early AA history. So let's follow him as he helped Bill Wilson and the other New Yorkers navigate their way through what Bill Wilson called the flying blind period from 1935 to 1939, the time before the book was actually written and published. Silkworth was constantly telling men being discharged from the hospital that they should be getting in touch with Bill Wilson. One such report comes from Bill Rudell, who left Towns Hospital in early 1937. This is taken from a 1957 letter that Rudell wrote to Bill Wilson. Rudell says that as he was being discharged from Towns Hospital in February of 1937, Dr. Silkworth referred him to Wilson, suggesting that he was someone who might be able to help him stay sober. Desperate to stay sober, Rudell and his wife Kathleen almost immediately visited the Wilsons at their home in Brooklyn, and after some heartfelt discussion, Bill invited them both upstairs, where, as Rudell reminded him, quote, Kathleen and I knelt down in front of the fireplace in your upstairs parlor with both you and Lois, and I made my surrender. So this is early 1937. Alcoholics Anonymous, both in New York City and in Akron, are still deeply involved with the Oxford group. And men were encouraged, almost insisted, that they get on their knees and surrender their life to God before they were admitted to the fellowship, if you will. So that was still going on in early 1937, even in New York. In the spring of 1937, Dr. Silkworth published 2 linked articles on alcoholism in the medical record. And the first one was called Alcoholism as a Manifestation of Allergy. This is Dr. Silkworth's famous diagnosis of the alcoholic drinker's problem, is that he's got an allergy to alcohol. And we're going to hear a lot more about that theory when we encounter it again in the doctor's opinion. That paper was followed 1 month later on April 21st, 1937, with his reclamation of the alcoholic. Now, he's already given us the diagnosis of what the alcoholic's problem is, and this particular paper detailed his suggested treatment as a solution to that problem. The revolutionary element here was Silkworth's insistence that after typical medical treatments that almost everybody already knew about, The prolonged recovery depended on the adoption of moral psychology. Moral psychology. Moral psychology is another thing we'll hear about in much more detail once we get to the doctor's opinion. But Dr. Silkworth's 2 articles were released just as the New York group was breaking itself away from the Oxford group, one of the most important and impactful events in early Alcoholics Anonymous history. So it was either April or May of 1937 that Bill and the entire New York group stepped back and stepped away from the Oxford group and started running things basically on their own. What's important for the purposes of our story today is that this break with the Oxford group led directly to the famous Counting Noses meeting that was held in Akron in 1937, several months after they broke with the Oxford group. And why is that important to this? Well, that's because at that meeting they decided to write a book. They're going to write a book about the cure that they had discovered for alcoholism. So the first mention of, oh, let's write a book comes in October 1937 at this Akron meeting. But first, they needed to raise a ton of money because it wasn't just the book that was going to need some financial help, but there was these 2 huge projects that they were planning to launch. They were going to have a string of alcoholic hospitals, kind of on the Towns model, all across the country, a whole string of hospitals all across the country dedicated to the reclamation of alcoholics. And of course, to get patients to come to that hospital and to set up meetings in cities, they were going to need a host of paid missionaries to go out and proselytize about this new cure for alcoholism. The Ohio members sent Bill back to New York to raise all that money. They were not about to cough up any cash for these projects. And 2 months later, after Bill and Hank were completely unsuccessful for 2 months trying to raise money, trying to get anybody to give them some cash, Bill and 7 other newly sober men met with 4 of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s closest friends to ask for money. Silkworth attended that meeting to vouch for the truth of what these men were saying about the miraculous recoveries they had seen in their group. So here we got a professional guy coming in and vouching for them, giving them some credibility. In the report on this meeting that Frank Amos wrote, Frank Amos was one of the 4 Rockefeller people. He wrote this report in the following August, so it was like 9 or 10 months later. He said, Dr. Silkworth, psychiatrist at Charles B. Towns Hospital, New York, which is rated as a leading hospital in this country for the treatment of alcoholics, made the statement that he had treated a number of these ex-alcoholics present, some of them several times, and that not one of them, in his opinion, could have been permanently cured by any means known to medical science or to psychiatry. He went on to state without reservation that while he could not tell what it was that these men had, which had affected their cure, yet he was convinced they were cured, and that whatever it was, it had his complete endorsement. He stated that alcoholism is medically an incurable disease. Amos concluded his report by saying that these statements from an outstanding psychiatrist and a leading authority on the treatment of alcoholism made a profound impression on the non-alcoholics present. That would be the 4 Rockefeller men. Silkworth's testimony lent instant credibility to these men's claims that they had discovered a cure. Medical science had no cure. They considered them incurable, but these guys had a cure. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to convince the Rockefellers to support them with a large amount of money. They were impressed, but not that impressed. Silkworth's commitment to allowing members of the fellowship work with his patients continued right up into 1938. I love this story of Ray Furlong. So he spends a week in Towns Hospital in early 1938, but then he got back home in Massachusetts. He started experimenting with a little controlled drinking shortly after he got back home. Predictably, this spun out of control in fairly short order. After a particularly spectacular drunk that June, his wife packed him up and drove him 150 miles back to New York City, where she redelivered him to Towns Hospital. Now, she was very upset, obviously. She'd already done this once before. Calming her fears at yet another relapse, Dr. Silkworth assured her that this time he felt he really had something that would work for Ray. What was that? 3 days later, after Ray's dried out a bit, Silkworth's promised solution arrived in the person of 2 members of the New York Fellowship. One came during the day, and another visited him later that night, who told Furlong they had been exactly like him not so long ago, but now they were free of their obsession for drink. The next day was Sunday, and Ray was visited by a third recovering alcoholic who carried a spiritual message, one that Furlong later described as, quote, a simple day-to-day plan of faith, end quote. The bedridden man was not just convinced, he surrendered completely, making a, quote, final agreement to let God be first in my life, end quote, after which he claimed, quote, the whole outlook and horizon brightened up in a manner which I am unable to describe except to say that it was glorious. In late May of 1938, just before Ray's final drunk, Bill Wilson started writing the first two chapters of the Big Book. Now, those were chapters where first chapter was There Is a Solution, and the second chapter was Bill's story. The order of these two chapters would famously be flipped before the book was published in April of 1939. But he was just going to write two chapters for starters, and those are the two chapters, and that was the order they were put in. They were going to do some exposition, and then they were going to have some testimony about how well it worked. But as Bill was writing his first draft of There Is a Solution, his right-hand man, Hank Parkhurst, was not particularly happy with what Bill was writing. He thought it was way too religious. But he offered Bill an 11-page handwritten document with his suggestions. These are my suggestions, Bill. We need to be doing things a little bit different here. And Bill titled that document Hank's Ideas. So this is the first page of that particular document. And that's Hank's handwriting at the top and Bill's handwriting at the bottom where it says Hank's Ideas. And note that Hank's final suggestion to Bill was that he should include, quote, Dr. Silkworth's letters. There we go. So right from the very, very beginning, the very first time in May of 1938, over into June of 1938, as Bill's writing these two chapters, already we're talking about getting Dr. Silkworth involved with the project. 2 weeks later, Parkhurst creates an outline for the Big Book. And this is what this looked like. This is the typed version that's held at the Stepping Stones Archive in New York. And this lays out 25 chapters for the book. And the first two are the ones that Bill's already working on. Then there's going to be chapters with a bunch of full-length stories. Then there's going to be some chapters with shorter stories. And then there's going to be some expositional chapters. So the original outline for the book had the stories up front and the exposition in the end, in the back part of the book. That again got flipped by the time we got to the 1939 version. Hank's proposed chapter 17 was custom tailored to be written by Dr. Silkworth. So here's chapter 17. Here's his testimony of a well-known physician who has specialized a lifetime with alcoholics. Dr. Silkworth. At his hospital, he has seen many of us recover, whom he has pronounced incurable. Dr. Silkworth. He will also cover the problems in lay language and from a medical and psychiatric point of view. Hank wasn't the only one suggesting they needed a strong statement of support from the medical community to give some veracity to this book they were hoping to publish. In mid-June of 1938, Frank Amos, Rockefeller guy, wrote to Albert Scott, the other Rockefeller guy, another one of those guys, and he said to Scott, "It is hoped that the endorsement of the book and of this work can be incorporated in it over the names of at least one outstanding physician of national reputation," that would be Dr. Silkworth, "and at least one person who is likewise well known, thus adding great strength and authenticity of what the book contains." Now, that second person, Bill was looking for somebody famous to write a preface to the book, and somebody who was famous for being a not drinker. He chased Henry Ford, who was considered a super dry, not just a prohibition guy, but a super dry guy. He chased Henry Ford for months and months and months, but never got close to the great man himself, and never got to Henry Ford to write a preface for the book. Added confirmation for the need to get a strong statement of support from a noted doctor came in mid-July of 1938, a month after Amos wrote his letter. Bill met with two prominent psychiatrists at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and after reading those two sample chapters, Dr. Esther Richards wrote Bill telling him that he really should get a #1 physician who has a wide knowledge of the alcoholic's medical and social problem to write an introduction for the book. So Bill and Hank spent most of June, the back half of June, all of July, all of August, and the front half of September trying to raise money for this string of hospitals and paid missionaries they've got a plan for. And they're not having any luck whatsoever in that. But as part of that process, trying to get more and more appointments, they request several letters of recommendation and validation from prominent people. Albert Scott writes one of those letters, and one of those letters comes from Dr. Silkworth. And on July 27th, he sent Bill this particular letter. And that's what it looks like on Charles B. Towns Hospital letterhead. So let's go through the text. This is what Dr. Silkworth wrote as a letter of recommendation for Bill Wilson. To whom it may concern, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. About 4 years ago, I attended a patient by the name of William G. Wilson. Though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, he was an alcoholic of a type I have come to regard as hopeless. In the course of his third treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his new conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they had to do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. This man and about 100 others appear to have recovered. I personally know 30 of these cases who were the types upon which other methods had failed completely. These facts appear to be of extreme medical importance. Because of the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth inherent in this group, these events may mark a new epoch in the annals of alcoholism. These men may well have a solution for thousands of these situations. You may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. Very truly yours, William K. Silkworth, MD. That letter was regularly copied and sent out with 2 chapters already written to people who they hoped to agree would give them some money for their grand projects. But 6 months later, Bill would find an even better use for this letter when he put it up in the front, right in the very beginning of the doctor's opinion. By the end of December 1938, Bill Wilson had completed the first draft of the book, and it was given to the critic Tom Usel to review and to make editing changes to. Although we have no contemporary documents telling us exactly when it was written, it's unlikely that the doctor's opinion was included in that package. And there's a couple of reasons why I would say that. Most likely that chapter was finished just before the multilith copy went to press on either February 16th or 17th of 1939. The book was published in April, but in mid-February of 1939, they did an offset printed copy of the whole text of the book, and they circulated it with a number of people asking for comments and suggestions. They wanted to make sure they got it right before they actually published the book. Besides the fact that there's no mention of this chapter, the doctor's opinion, before the printing of the multilith copy, the separate numbering of the doctor's opinion in the multilith copy implies that it's a last-minute inclusion. That's because pages 1 through 4, the doctor's opinion are numbered pages 1 through 4, while Bill's story starts on page 1 again. I am suggesting, I am presuming, I am guessing here, I am speculating here that Ruth had already typed up the entire front half of that book, starting with page 1 for Bill's story, and then she gets this thing from Dr. Silkworth. So rather than retyping and renumbering all those pages, she just numbered the doctor's opinion 1 through 4, and then it just appeared right in front of Bill's story, which started again with number 1. The chapter, the doctor's opinion, contains 2 short statements written by Bill Wilson. The first one introduces Dr. Silkworth's letter of recommendation, while the second serves as a preface to the doctor's longer statement, enthusiastically endorsing the solution of alcoholism offered in the book. We don't know exactly how these 2 men went about cobbling together these different elements, and we don't even know if they edited each other's work. But we can see some interesting edits and comments in the master copy of the multilith. That's the one where they sent out the multilith copy for suggestions and comments and corrections, and Hank Parkhurst kept 1 copy of that multilith in his office in Newark, New Jersey, and wrote down all of those different suggestions, comments, and corrections. So we got a couple of little things happening that are being suggested changes in the master copy in Hank's office in New Jersey. This is what the First, the 4 pages of the doctor's opinion look like in the master copy. No changes going on there. The second page shows an interesting edit and comment at the top of the page. The rest of the page seems to be okay. Hank added a phrase and a comment at the top. He added as well as an altruistic. And that changes the sentence that he will now read, though we work on our solution on a spiritual as well as an altruistic plane. And he's got a little arrow going off to the left there, explaining why it's important to put that in. He says, this frees criticism of Bill where he says, you cannot get well unless you work with others. So this is the introduction of the altruistic, I'm going to pay attention to and be my brother's keeper kind of thing. The third page has a number of corrections and comments appearing in 4 different sections. So I'm going to take this in 4 different sections. Once again, Hank records a comment. The original line was the community movement now growing up among them. And the comment was, community is too light a word. Too light a word to describe what you men are doing. Might mean community, Christ, etc. And again, this is a comment made by someone on the book, most likely a minister. Somebody, certainly when he says what you men are doing, implies that he's not a member of the fellowship, the person making the correction. And here's one example of a suggestion change that was not taken at the very bottom of that paragraph. This psychic change involves substitution of a good compulsion for a harmful one. We don't want to be saying that. So that was somebody's idea of a good idea, but it was not taken. And some changes were accepted and others were not. The word control, upper left-hand corner here, handwritten, was substituted for the word condition. Somebody wanted to add the matter of, that was not added to the text. In the middle, it says, see page 10, paragraph 7, sentence 2. And what's that all about? And that refers to the famous sentence later in the text of, therefore, the real problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than his body. And then at the very bottom, the note points out what they perceive as a contradiction. So, and finally, on this third page, the word constitutional is objected to. And it says, it's called a wastebasket term. That's constitutional, kind of interesting, a wastebasket term. And the sentence at the bottom has been completely crossed out. And the sentence was, then there are those who are never properly adjusted to life, who are the so-called neurotics. The prognosis of this type is unfavorable. Dr. Howard, you see it says Dr. H. Dr. Howard was one of the people who had the most criticisms of things that were in the book. And he was the one who, and Bill okayed it, obviously, who said, you need to get rid of that sentence. It's just, I presume he thought it was too strong. Dr. Howard, by the way, is one of the people who made some of the most important suggestions for the book. Most especially, he told Bill Wilson he had to take out all the very directive language. There was a lot of yous in the book when the multilith copy was printed. You have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do this. And Dr. Howard said, listen, you can't tell alcoholics anything. You need to take that directive language and turn it into suggestive language. You need to say, well, this is what we did. And if you try this, it might work this way. And Wilson did, in fact, make most of those changes to the text. Reluctantly, but he made them. It's deleted by Dr. Howard and approved by Bill. It was thought the fourth page didn't need any work at all. So finally, we arrive at the doctor's opinion as printed in the first edition of the book. And this is what it looked like, page number 1. As already noted, Bill opens the chapter with a paragraph introducing Dr. Silkworth's letter written the previous July to believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. Convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience with the suffering of our members and have witnessed our return to health. A well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. That letter was printed almost exactly like the original, the one we just read, but there were in fact 3 small changes. Where the letter had mentioned William G. Wilson by name as the patient he had attended about 4 years ago, in the book, Bill's name was replaced by an anonymous who. Now that makes perfect sense. In the letter of recommendation, you're trying to get a guy an appointment, you got to at least know who this guy is. So his name had to be in that letter. But when it gets published in the book, we're going for anonymity here. So Bill's name is taken out and who is put in. A more positive spin was put on this sentence here. these events may mark a new epoch, and it was changed into this group may mark a new epoch. I'm sorry, this group, they mark. So we went from may mark, which is conditional, to they mark, to very, very assertive. And these men may well have a solution for thousands of these situations, and somehow that gets changed for some reason I really don't understand too. These men may well have a remedy for thousands of these situations. Perhaps remedy was thought to sound more medical than solution. I don't really know why that change was made. Bill Wilson then comes back into the chapter to say a few things. The physician, who at our request gave us that letter, has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement, which follows. In this statement, he confirms what anyone who has suffered alcoholic torture must believe, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. The doctor's theory that we have a kind of allergy to alcohol interests us. As laymen, our opinion as to its soundness may, of course, mean little, but as ex-alcoholics, we can say that his explanation makes good sense. It explains many things for which we cannot otherwise account. Though we work out our solution on a spiritual plane, we favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who is very jittery or befogged. More often than not, it is imperative that a man's brain be cleared before he is approached, as he has then a better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer. Silkworth, after that introduction, Silkworth then takes up over the remaining 5.5 pages of this chapter. So everything that follows this second statement by Bill Wilson is Dr. Silkworth's voice. It seems to me that there are 4 important threads running through this chapter, and they're kind of intermixed. So I'm going to try and unthread them and unbundle them and take them separately. The first one is Silkworth's lavish praise for Alcoholics Anonymous. The second deals with Silkworth's diagnosis of alcoholism. The third deals with his solution for that diagnosis of the problem of alcoholism. And the fourth is his concluding stories. So the first thread, Silkworth's praise of AA. He acknowledges that AA has successfully filled the gap that, quote, our scientific approach, end quote, has not been able to provide, while favorably noting the unselfishness of these men, their entire absence of a profit motive, and their community spirit. Silkworth says, it's indeed inspiring to see these recovered men who now believe in themselves and still more in the power which pulls chronic alcoholics back from the gates of death. He then elaborates on how helpless and hopeless a physician who treats alcoholics can feel. He says, faced with this problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he gives all that is in him, it is often not enough. We physicians must admit that we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. The doctor then concludes, we feel after many years of experience that we have found nothing which has contributed more to the rehabilitation of these men than the altruistic movement now growing up among them, and notes that their method of recovery is explained in masterly detail in these pages. High professional praise indeed for Alcoholics Anonymous, coming from a guy with the kind of deep experience that Silkworth has had. The second thread is the doctor's diagnosis. So Silkworth had offered his diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem in a paper he'd written 2 years ago, where we mentioned before, alcoholism as a manifestation of allergy. There he claimed that the true alcoholic suffers from an allergy. His paper stated that this condition was typically something that developed over time, although he admits that some people are just born with it. But he says that allergy was similar to the phenomenon of people who have developed hay fever late in life. Quite frankly, before I prepared for this presentation, I had never read that paper all the way through, and I'd never noticed this analogy between alcoholism and hay fever. And I, as a guy who developed hay fever late in life, I thought that was a really fascinating and powerful analogy for me. Like the hay fever sufferer, Silkworth says this condition never goes away for the alcoholic. Even if they don't drink for a year or longer, the full symptomology will kick in once they pick up even a single drink. But the doctor's opinion Silkworth puts much more stress on the major symptom related to this allergy. So you've got an allergy, but how do you know it? I mean, what's the symptom? And that's namely that when the chronic alcoholic picks up the first drink, the phenomenon of craving immediately kicks in and drinking becomes paramount to all other interests. So we've got an allergy, but how do you know you've got an allergy? Well, if you're one of those people who after you pick up the first drink, the phenomenon of craving kicks in, you've got that allergy to alcohol. Silkworth explains why the alcoholic picks up that first drink, an interesting point we're going to talk about again in a minute. Silkworth explains why the alcoholic picks up that first drink in some of the most famous words in the doctor's opinion. Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once from taking a few drinks. So alcoholics, they start drinking because they're restless, irritable, and discontented, and they're looking for that sense of ease and comfort that they know comes. All you got to do is pick up a drink. I think it's important to note here that Dr. Silkworth's diagnosis of the alcoholic's basic problem, that once he starts drinking, he cannot stop, is most certainly a valid observation and one of the most obvious hallmarks of alcoholism. But that diagnosis, Silkworth's diagnosis, is radically different from the one that Bill Wilson will offer, and there is a solution. Namely, that a real alcoholic, Silkworth had called him a true alcoholic, Bill says a real alcoholic. I'm not sure why he wanted to change that. What's a real alcoholic? A real alcoholic is a person who has a terrible, terrible, terrible track record with drinking and no alcohol whatsoever in their body. But they just have to be somehow insane to pick up the first drink. If you've got no booze in your body and you know the dreadful consequences that happen to you over and over and over again, you got to be crazy. Both men are onto something true in their respective diagnosis. They are not talking at cross purposes. They are not contradicting each other. They're just coming at it from a bit of a different perspective. But Bill's diagnosis pushes the question back farther than Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Silkworth is talking about, you start drinking, the phenomenon of craving kicks in. Bill says, yeah, well, sure. We know we can't quit once we start. But why do we start in the first place? Why do we start in the first place? Why would we start when we have no booze in our body? Why would we pick up that first drink? And Bill says that's because we're insane. And in the second step, when he talks about restoring us to sanity, that's the sanity we're going back to. The sanity is going to keep us away from that first drink. We're not going to have those strange mental blank spots that boom, all of a sudden common sense and self-knowledge and everything just goes right out of your head and you pick up the first drink. These very different approaches and conclusions can likely best be explained by noting that Silkworth had produced his diagnosis based on his observations. Bill Wilson's diagnosis was based on his experiences. Very, very different perspectives. So let's talk about the third thread, the doctor's solution to alcoholism. The scientific doctor advocates for moral psychology as a solution to the alcoholic's dilemma, because he believes it brings about the essential psychic change needed for the alcoholic to stop drinking and to stay sober. So we're going to do a little moral psychology, and this moral psychology, when you practice that, is going to produce the essential psychic change needed to keep you away from booze. This is Dr. Silkworth's solution to the problem of alcoholism. Exactly what does Dr. Silkworth say about moral psychology in the doctor's opinion? Well, actually, he doesn't say much, but he does mention it twice. He says, we doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics, but its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. While with our ultra-modern standards, our scientific approach to everything, we are perhaps not well equipped to apply the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. And then in one of the stories at the very close of this chapter, he says, his alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology. And we doubted if even that would have any effect. So there's those two mentions, but there's no further explanations given in the big book other than that moral psychology is a critical element in the essential psychic change needed to get and stay sober. So what is this moral psychology? What's the doctor talking about? There were four major sections in that second article from 1937, Reclamation of the Alcoholic, that we talked about. There's four major sections. And the fourth section boldly entitled Moral Psychology. So we can finally get some information on what moral psychology is by looking back at this 1937 paper that Silkworth wrote. And this is what he wrote. Moral psychology, we believe that this decision is in the nature of inspiration, this decision to adopt moral psychology. The patient knows he has reached a lasting conclusion and experiences a sense of great relief. These individuals, introverts for the most part, by the way, I always have to point out that he's using that phrase, the word introverts, not as being someone quiet and reserved and over in the corner by themselves, but somebody who's just can't do anything but pay attention to themselves. Their introverts are all about me people in his understanding of use of that word. These individuals, introverts for the most part, whose interests center entirely in themselves, once they have made their decision, frequently ask, how can they help others? And he presents two cases here. Case number 3, in the previous sections of this paper, there were 2 cases. So now we're up to case 3. And this is basically Hank Parker's. Case number 3, following through elimination and medical rehabilitation, we got to do the medical stuff. He made a satisfactory physical recovery. He then took up moral psychology, and in 2 years' time has entirely recovered his lost fortune and has been elected to a prominent public position. On meeting this patient recently, we experienced a strange sensation. While we recognized the features, a different man seemed to be speaking, as if a self-confident stranger had stepped into this man's body, all because he had adopted moral psychology. And case number 4 is Bill Wilson. Following the course of treatment in which the alcohol and toxic products were eliminated and his cravings counteracted, the medical stuff was done, he took up moral psychology. He gives part of his income to help others in his former position and has gathered about him a group of over 50 men, all free from their former alcoholism through the application of this method of treatment, the medical treatment, and moral psychology. Dr. Silkworth then concludes this article with a single short paragraph advocating for his solution and praising the men of Alcoholics Anonymous. He says, to such patients, to alcoholic patients, we recommend moral psychology. In those of our patients who have joined or initiated such group, the change has been spectacular. You need to get some medical treatment. You need to be dried out properly. And then you need to get some moral psychology if you want to stay sober. Clearly, the point of this moral psychology is to bring about the essential psychic change needed for the alcoholic to stop drinking and stay sober. But what is that? What is the essential psychic change? This phrase, the psychic change, appears 3 times on a single page of the doctor's opinion. And I think it's worthwhile if we take a look at those. After alcoholics have succumbed to the desire again, drink, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops, they pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution not to drink again. This, however, is repeated over and over, and unless this person can experience an entire psychic change, there is very little hope of his recovery. On the other hand, and strange as this may seem to those who do not understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seems doomed, who had so many problems he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol. Easily able to control his desire for alcohol. The only effort necessary being that required to follow a few simple rules. And finally, on the same page, the third mention, we feel that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Though the aggregate of recoveries resulting from psychiatric effort is considerable, we physicians must admit that we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. So once again, this solution is somewhat different from the one that Bill Wilson's going to offer when we get to the chapter, There is a Solution. Namely, that the real alcoholic, this is Bill's solution, where the real alcoholic, someone who is completely powerless over the first drink, has to have a vital spiritual experience if they're to avoid picking up that first drink. A vital spiritual experience. On one level, this is just something of a categorical difference. Again, these two men are not talking to cross purposes. They are not contradicting each other on any level. Dr. Silkworth's essential psychic change is just general and vague, while Bill's vital spiritual experience is much more specific about what kind of psychic change is required. That change has to be spiritual. And Bill has instructions in the rest of the book on how to get one of those vital spiritual experiences. Once again, I want to suggest that these two very different but equally valid approaches to the alcoholic solution were the result of one man's working from his observations and the other one working from his experiences. One of them was a doctor, he was a scientist, and the other one was a drunk, living his way through his own miserable life drinking. Okay, now for the fourth thread, the stories. Having done his best to explain his theories about alcoholism, Dr. Silkworth closes this chapter with a time-tested Alcoholics Anonymous approach. He gives up trying to explain logically and clearly and scientifically his explanation, and he offers the reader two instructive stories. You know, he gets to the point where, okay, you've read all this stuff, and then he says, so he starts with this leading question. He says, so what is the solution? What is the solution? Really? And he then suggests, perhaps I can best answer this by relating one of my experiences. And then he goes on to offer actually two of his experiences. But I just think it's so interesting that having talked about it the best he can, this is like so much of the rest of the book that we're gonna be looking at going forward. Like so much of the book, after we've tried to explain it, let me tell you a story. Read the story, and then you'll understand what's going on here. So Silkworth's doing exactly the same thing. Although they are not identified by name, the first story is Hank Parkhurst, and the second is Fitz Mayo, the two men that Bill Wilson had first helped get sober when he returned to New York in August of '35. Both stories recount how desperately ill and near death these men were when Dr. Silkworth first met them, and how hopeless they were until they, quote, accepted the plan outlined in this book. With two such dramatic examples, the chapter closes with these ringing words from Dr. Silkworth. He said, quote, I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. Just one other kind of historical note I'd like to note. It's been alleged that these final 5.5 pages came from an article Dr. Silkworth would publish 3 months after the big book came out in April of 1939. But the evidence doesn't support this claim. That article, which was called Psychological Rehabilitation of Alcoholics, contains 28 paragraphs, and only 9 of them come from the doctor's opinion. So in addition, that article specifically notes that the group's program of recovery is admirably told in a book written by them entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. So it would seem likely to me that the doctor's opinion came first and the article in the medical journal was written shortly after that. Internal evidence suggests that strongly. Now, so this leaves us with two burning questions about this chapter. Things that come up all the time, anytime anyone wants to question what's going on in the doctor's opinion. They want to know, why isn't Dr. Silkworth's name printed at the end of the chapter? His name was just dashed out. And the second big burning question is, why was the numbering of the doctor's opinion changed from Arabic numerals 1, 2, 3, 4 to Roman numerals XXIII in the second edition of the big book? Why was that change made? Those are good questions. They are. They're really good questions. Unfortunately, the archives have so far not offered up any answers to those things, which leaves us with only speculation and best guesses. So we're going to move away from some of this historical, factual stuff we've been doing, and we're going into the area of speculation and best guesses. So here's one suggestion for why Dr. Silkworth's name doesn't appear at the end of the thing. The most popular guess is that Silkworth's name was not printed at the end of the doctor's opinion because he was so well known as the head physician of Towns Hospital that identifying him as the author might have been seen as an endorsement of that hospital. And they most certainly did not want to be caught out. They was really worried about Bill Wilson's always talking about they're going to be accused of being a racket, a money-making racket, trying to save alcoholics. So they didn't want to be clearly accused of endorsing Towns Hospital. And then the second suggestion is people say that they presume that Dr. Silkworth had a reluctance to have his name so closely tied with the fledgling Alcoholics Anonymous. And certainly Silkworth had published professional articles on his experience and theories about alcoholism, but he still, these people presume, may have felt that putting his professional reputation on the line with this very new and as yet unproven organization was just a bit too risky. So the first suggestion is that the AA people didn't want to put his name in because it might make them look bad as an endorsement for Towns Hospital. The second presumption is that Dr. Silkworth didn't want to put his name in because he was afraid he'd be too closely linked to that and that might besmirch his character or his reputation in some way. If these are the two most plausible suggestions, and they're the two most plausible suggestions I've ever heard, I'd be happy to hear more suggestions if people know them. I would be voting for the first. I don't think Silkworth was worried about his besmirching his reputation, but that's just my opinion. The renumbering of the pages is a bit more complicated. It's still one without any satisfactory conclusions. As noted earlier in the multilith copy, mid-February 1939, before the big book gets printed, the doctor's opinion was numbered pages 1 through 4. And then Bill's story starts on page 1 again. And then in the first edition of the big book, the doctor's opinion starts on page 1, and Bill's story starts on page 10. Really? Yeah, really. All 16 printings of the first edition had doctor's opinion starting on page 1. Bill's story starts on page 10. And by the way, that made the whole front of the book take up 179 pages rather than the hallowed 164 pages that are found in the second, third, and fourth editions. Once they started renumbering with Bill on page 1, it changed everything going forward, obviously. But when the second edition came out in 1955, the doctor's opinion now followed the Roman numerals used for the first two forwards, and it started on page XXIII, 23, Roman numerals for 23, while Bill's story now began on page 1. Perhaps the most plausible reason for this change is the suggestion that the decision to use Roman numerals for the doctor's opinion was driven by the belief that it was important to separate the medical man's opinion from the one drunk talking to another drunk opinions found in the rest of the book. So what people are suggesting was that this decision was made because they wanted to separate and put a kind of a wall between the medical opinion and the alcoholics speaking to other alcoholics' opinions. And someone further speculated to me recently that Bill realized the need to do this as he was writing and as he finished and polished up the 12 traditions, which were adopted in 1950, 5 years before this second edition came out. But that suggestion is just speculation because there is, to my knowledge, no recorded evidence of why this change was made. I haven't seen anything in the archives on that, nor has anyone else brought anything out of the archives to my attention about that. But that lack of explanation really bothers some of the big book's most serious readers. This is one of those issues that just doesn't seem to go away. For instance, there was a motion made at the most recent General Service Conference last April to start the doctor's opinion on page 1 again. Let's start the doctor's opinion on page 1 again. Let's give it some more credibility by doing that. But that motion did not receive enough support to pass. So here's the question. Is the doctor's opinion best served as a preface to the big book with Arabic numerals? Or would it get more attention, the attention it more so rightly deserves, it was fully incorporated in the regular pagination of the book? People say that a lot of readers just jump to page 1. So they're worried that they're jumping the doctor's opinion to go right into Bill's story. Interesting question. But alas, no conclusive answer. And that makes it a good place as any to end this overview of the doctor's opinion. Thank you.